Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For most Americans, foreign policy seems pretty straightforward. The president gets elected, the president chooses a Secretary of State, the State Department carries out the administration's foreign policy, and 4 years later, voters decide whether they want more of the same. But what if that picture is incomplete? What happens when the president wants to fundamentally change America's foreign policy, but the bureaucracy responsible for carrying it out has a very different view of what American foreign policy should look like? And this isn't just a theoretical debate. In December 2025, the Trump administration recalled nearly 30 career diplomats serving as ambassadors and senior embassy officials under the previous administration. Their overseas assignments were being ended, with the State Department arguing that ambassadors are the president's personal representatives and must be able to advance his America First agenda. Critics saw something very different: the politicization of America's professional diplomatic corps. And suddenly, a much bigger question came into focus. Who really runs American foreign policy? The president who was elected to change it? Or the permanent bureaucracy that remains after every election? That question matters far beyond Donald Trump. Because if you believe elections are supposed to change government policy, then the answer seems obvious. Elected officials should be in charge. But if you believe foreign policy is too complicated to be reshaped every 4 years, then experienced career professionals inside the State Department have an equally important argument, and somewhere between those two positions lies the real challenge facing American diplomacy. The Trump administration has been much more selective about ambassadorial appointments than previous administrations, and the people being considered aren't being judged solely on experience. The administration is asking another question: will this person faithfully carry out the president's foreign policy? That distinction is extremely important, because an ambassador isn't just a foreign policy expert. An ambassador is the president's representative in another country. If the president has been elected on a promise to fundamentally change America's foreign policy, it is reasonable for that president to want representatives abroad who actually support that policy. Imagine a president promising to reduce America's overseas commitments, make allies carry more of the defense burden, rethink foreign aid, challenge international institutions, and put American interests ahead of global consensus. Then imagine that many of the officials responsible for implementing those policies believe they are dangerous. We would have a problem. Not necessarily because those officials are disloyal, and not necessarily because the president is right, but because the American people elected one government, while parts of the permanent bureaucracy may be operating according to a very different set of assumptions. And we've seen this tension before. During Trump's first term, after he introduced restrictions on entry from several countries in 2017, roughly 1,000 State Department officials signed a formal dissent cable criticizing the policy. From one perspective, that demonstrated something healthy. Career diplomats were willing to defend their professional judgment and object to policies they believed were wrong. From another perspective, Trump's supporters saw something very different. A large part of the foreign policy bureaucracy openly resisting one of the president's signature policies, and that brings us to the heart of the argument. What exactly is the job of a career diplomat? Is it to provide the president with professional advice, even when that advice is unpopular? Absolutely. But once the president has made a lawful decision, is it the diplomat's job to implement that decision? Also, yes, those two principles have to coexist. And this is where I think the debate often becomes too simplistic. It is tempting to divide Washington into two camps. On one side, you have the elected president and his political appointees. On the other, you have the permanent bureaucracy. And then you simply declare one side good and the other side bad. But that's not how a serious foreign policy system should work. Career diplomats possess something presidents desperately need: experience. They spend years studying individual countries. They understand local political systems, languages, personalities, military capabilities, and historical relationships. A president who ignores all of that expertise would be making a huge mistake. But there is an equally serious danger on the other side. If career professionals begin to believe that their expertise gives them the right to override elected leadership, then expertise can slowly become political power. And that creates a democratic problem. Because Americans don't elect a permanent Secretary of State. They elect a president, The president has constitutional authority over the executive branch and plays the central role in shaping foreign policy. The State Department is supposed to help execute that policy. That doesn't mean diplomats have to agree with everything the president says. In fact, they should be able to disagree. They should be able to tell the president, "Mr. President, I think you're wrong. Here are the reasons." That's not disloyalty. That's expertise. But there is a line between advising the president and replacing the president. Once a lawful decision has been made, the bureaucracy has to carry it out. Professional independence before the decision, political accountability after the decision. That's the balance America needs. The deeper concern among Trump supporters is that America's foreign policy establishment has developed its own institutional worldview over several decades. That worldview tends to emphasize alliances, international institutions, multilateral organizations, foreign aid, and global cooperation. None of those things are inherently anti-American. In fact, many have produced real benefits for the United States. But the question is whether those institutions and assumptions should remain largely insulated from electoral politics. Trump's answer is clearly no. His America First approach starts from a different premise. Before Washington asks what an international organization wants, it should ask what the United States wants. Before America spends money abroad, it should ask whether that spending serves American interests. Before Washington accepts the recommendations of foreign policy institutions, it should ask whether those institutions are actually aligned with the priorities voters chose at the ballot box. That philosophy is controversial, but it is not inherently undemocratic. In fact, you could argue that it is a perfectly legitimate response to a basic democratic principle. Elections are supposed to have consequences. If voters elect a president because they want a different foreign policy, then that president should have the ability to change the people responsible for implementing it. Otherwise, elections become partly symbolic. Voters choose a new president, but the institutions underneath him continue operating according to the assumptions of the previous administration. And that is where Trump's effort to reshape the State Department becomes much more interesting. The ambassador issue is only the visible part. The real objective may be much larger. Changing who rises through the State Department, who gets promoted, who becomes an ambassador, and eventually what kind of culture dominates the institution. Imagine that over the next several years, the administration consistently promotes career diplomats who believe in a more explicitly America First foreign policy. Those diplomats gain experience. They become ambassadors, then senior officials, then, eventually, leaders inside the department. Over time, the institution itself changes. That would be a much deeper transformation than simply replacing a few ambassadors. And this is precisely why the permanent bureaucracy has reason to be concerned. Because institutional power isn't only about who occupies an office today, it's about who gets promoted tomorrow. It's about which ideas are considered normal. It's about which people are considered leadership material. And ultimately, it's about what kind of people shape American policy for the next 20 years. But here is where I would add an important warning to the Trump argument. Changing the bureaucracy is not the same thing as destroying the bureaucracy. And loyalty should never become a substitute for competence. If Trump replaces experienced diplomats simply because they disagree with him politically, that could weaken American diplomacy rather than strengthen it. A strong president should want diplomats who will execute his policies, but a smart president should also want people around him who are willing to tell him when they think he is making a mistake. That is the difference between a professional institution and a political echo chamber. And there is another reason this matters right now. America's allies are already watching Trump's foreign policy transformation with concern. In Europe, the Middle East, and especially Asia, America's allies have become increasingly uncertain about how much Washington is willing to spend, how much responsibility it is willing to assume, and how long it intends to remain the central security provider. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines are all increasing their own defense capabilities. They're buying more weapons. They're expanding military cooperation. They're preparing for a world in which America may demand that allies do more for themselves. But here's the interesting part. Most of these countries aren't actually preparing to replace the United States. They're preparing for the possibility that America might become less predictable. And that distinction matters. America's allies still believe the United States is the only country capable of providing the kind of strategic military balance they need in the Indo-Pacific. So even while they worry about Trump, they are also trying to keep America engaged. That tells us something important. The debate over America's foreign policy isn't happening in a vacuum. Washington's internal struggle is being watched by the rest of the world. Every ambassadorial appointment, every military deployment, every treaty negotiation, and every statement from the State Department sends a signal about what kind of America the world should expect. And that brings us back to the original question. Who really runs American foreign policy? I don't think the answer should be the president alone. And I don't think the answer should be the bureaucracy either. The president needs the expertise of career diplomats. Career diplomats need the authority of elected leadership. Congress has its constitutional role. And ultimately, voters need to know that when they choose a different government, their choice can actually change the direction of the country. The real danger is at either extreme. If the bureaucracy becomes powerful enough to resist every elected administration it dislikes, democracy becomes weaker. But if presidents become powerful enough to demand ideological loyalty from every professional who works for them, expertise and institutional competence become weaker. Neither outcome is good for America. So I think the most important question isn't whether Trump should take over the State Department, it's whether he can reform it without destroying the professional independence that makes American diplomacy effective. That is a much harder challenge. And it is also a much more important one. Because America has spent decades building a global diplomatic system, the question now is whether that system works for the country as it exists today, or whether it has gradually developed priorities of its own. Trump believes the system needs a fundamental reset. His critics believe he is politicizing a professional institution. Both sides have a point, but there is one principle we should not lose sight of. In a constitutional democracy, bureaucrats don't get elected, presidents do. That doesn't mean presidents are always right. It doesn't mean experts should remain silent, and it certainly doesn't mean loyalty should replace competence. It means that after all the arguments have been made, the final political responsibility has to belong to the people who were elected to make the decision. Maybe that's the real issue behind Trump's ambassador appointments. This isn't ultimately a story about 30 diplomats. It's a story about power. It's about whether America's permanent institutions serve the elected government, or whether elected governments eventually become temporary guests inside permanent institutions. And if Trump succeeds in reshaping the State Department, the consequences won't end when his presidency ends. They could influence the culture of American diplomacy for decades. The bigger question, then, isn't simply, is Trump right? It's this. How do you make a powerful bureaucracy accountable to democracy without destroying the expertise that democracy needs? That is a question America will have to answer not just under Trump, but long after Trump is gone. Thanks for watching.